The world has witnessed countless atrocities, but few have been buried under layers of silence as deep as this one. History remembers the names of Hitler, of Auschwitz, of Hiroshima, but there is another name, one that was nearly erased, hidden behind the walls of a so-called research facility in the frozen lands of Manchuria. It was here, under the Japanese Empire's flag, that science turned into a weapon of unimaginable cruelty. This place was called Unit 731. The year was 1932. Japan had already invaded Manchuria and established a puppet state they called Manchukuo. Behind the front lines, inside the occupied territory, the Japanese Kwantung Army built laboratories and barracks, claiming they were for disease prevention and water purification. But inside those walls, a different kind of science was being practiced, one that stripped away all sense of morality, compassion, and humanity, and the man at the center of it all was General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant, ambitious microbiologist who saw war not as horror, but as opportunity. Ishii believed that biological weapons were the key to Japan's dominance. He wanted to create tools that could kill silently, invisible agents of death that could wipe out entire armies or cities without a single bullet fired. To him, microbes were more powerful than bombs. Under his leadership, Unit 731 was established in Pingfang, near the Chinese city of Harbin. Its official name sounded harmless: the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. But behind that polite name stood one of the most inhumane facilities in human history. Every brick of the compound was built on secrecy. Surrounded by high walls, barbed wire, and guards with rifles, no one outside knew what was happening inside. The people of nearby villages only whispered about the strange smoke that rose from the chimneys, the trains that arrived at night carrying prisoners who never came out again. They called it the Factory of Death. Inside, men in white coats, doctors, scientists, and soldiers, worked together under Ishii's command. But they weren't saving lives. They were ending them. Their subjects were not volunteers, nor were they soldiers. They were ordinary people. Chinese civilians, farmers, women, children, prisoners of war. They were called Maruda, a Japanese word meaning logs. To Ishii and his men, these human beings were nothing more than test material. Each morning, the corridors of Unit 731 echoed with screams. In the surgical rooms, bright lamps hung above metal tables. Here, vivisections, dissections of living people, were performed without anesthesia. The victims were tied down as doctors cut them open to observe how diseases attacked the body in real time. Hearts were still beating, lungs still breathing, when scalpels sliced through skin and organs. The doctors took notes, their handwriting neat, their expressions cold. This was not cruelty for pleasure. It was cruelty for science. Others were subjected to deliberate infection. Plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid. Bacteria were injected directly into their bloodstream. Scientists wanted to study how fast the diseases would spread, how long it would take for fever to set in, how the skin would rot, how the body would decay. Some were forced to drink contaminated water. Others were bitten by infected fleas or rats. Each victim became an experiment in pain. In one chamber, frostbite experiments took place. Prisoners were taken outside during the brutal Manchurian winter. Their arms were exposed to freezing temperatures until the skin turned hard and white, until ice crystals formed beneath the flesh. Then the limbs were beaten with sticks. If the sound was like breaking glass, the scientists knew the frostbite was complete. Some arms were then thawed under hot water to see if the tissue could recover. Others were amputated while the victims were still conscious. Notes were taken meticulously: temperature, duration, color of the skin, data that would later be used to study cold endurance for Japanese soldiers. In another part of the facility, pressure chambers tested how much air pressure a human body could withstand before lungs collapsed. Some victims were spun in centrifuges until they lost consciousness, their internal organs crushed by the force. Others were locked in sealed rooms and exposed to poison gas. Shiro Ishii wanted to know how long it would take a human to die, and how efficiently. Pregnant women were not spared. Many had been deliberately impregnated by guards or fellow prisoners, so that Ishii's team could study how diseases affected unborn babies. Fetuses were infected, dissected, and catalogued. Mothers were cut open alive, their bodies treated as laboratory equipment. Children too young to speak were used for experiments on vaccines and frostbite. There was no mercy, no humanity, no voice of conscience inside those walls. To the scientists of Unit 731, the human body was a machine, and they wanted to know how to destroy it in every possible way. The experiments weren't confined to the laboratory. Ishii wanted to see how his biological weapons would work in real warfare. Entire Chinese villages were turned into testing grounds. Japanese aircraft dropped bombs filled with plague, infected fleas, wheat, and rice contaminated with deadly bacteria. Wells were poisoned. Food was infected. Thousands of civilians, men, women, children, died from diseases they never understood. Some towns were completely wiped off the map, victims of an invisible enemy. The plague spread beyond control, and even Japanese soldiers were infected. But to Ishii, this was progress. Those who survived infection were captured and brought back to the facility for observation. Their bodies were studied until death. Every result was documented: incubation time, mortality rate, rate of transmission, all in the name of military research. The people working inside Unit 731 weren't monsters in the traditional sense. Many were young doctors, graduates from top Japanese universities. They had families, wives, and children of their own. But inside the compound, they followed orders without question. The uniform, the system, and the fear of punishment turned them into tools of cruelty. They believed they were serving their country, advancing science, and ensuring Japan's future. It was blind patriotism mixed with scientific arrogance, a deadly combination. Outside, the war raged on. Japan's empire expanded across Asia, China, Korea, the Philippines. But as the tide turned and Allied forces pushed back, Ishii grew desperate to protect his secrets. He ordered more tests, more data, more results. Thousands of prisoners were executed to prevent information leaks. When the end of the war seemed near, Ishii gave the command to destroy everything. Buildings were blown up, documents burned, and the remaining prisoners, every last one, were executed. But not all secrets can be buried forever. In August 1945, Japan surrendered after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The empire had fallen. Allied troops moved into Manchuria, and rumors began to surface about what had happened at Pingfang. Soviet forces uncovered parts of the facility, the remains of equipment, bones buried in the snow. Word spread. Japan had been conducting human experiments on a massive scale. But when the Americans arrived, something unexpected happened. Instead of putting Shiro Ishii and his men on trial, the United States offered them a deal. In exchange for immunity from war crimes, Ishii and his scientists handed over all their research data, years of biological warfare information that could not be replicated anywhere else. The U.S. government saw value in their findings. The Cold War was beginning and biological weapons research was becoming a strategic priority. So the men of Unit 731 walked free. Ishii lived quietly in Japan after the war. He was never prosecuted. Some say he continued working secretly for U.S. intelligence. Others claim he lived a comfortable life, even giving lectures to medical students. Many of his subordinates became professors, doctors, or businessmen. None faced true justice for what they had done. For decades, Japan denied the existence of Unit 731. The victims were forgotten, their families silenced. It wasn't until survivors and former soldiers began speaking out in the 1980s that the truth finally began to surface. Bones were found. Documents were uncovered. The world began to understand the scale of what had happened, and the silence that followed it. Today in Harbin, China, there stands a museum on the ruins of the old Unit 731 facility. Visitors walk through cold, empty corridors where thousands once suffered. The walls bear photographs, artifacts, and testimonies, reminders of a time when science lost its soul. Some visitors leave in tears, others in disbelief. But everyone leaves with the same thought: how could human beings do this to one another? When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the world expected justice. At Nuremberg, Nazi doctors were tried for experimenting on prisoners. In Asia, people waited for the same reckoning. But in the ruins of Manchuria, silence settled over the compound that had once been Unit 731. The chimneys were cold, the laboratories empty, the records burned to ash. Only scattered bones remained in the frozen soil, fragments of lives that no one would claim. Soviet troops arrived first. They found surgical tables, broken glass jars labeled with Latin names of bacteria, and metal restraints bolted to operating benches. They gathered what evidence they could and took statements from captured Japanese soldiers. In 1949, the Soviets held their own war crimes tribunal in Khabarovsk, where several of Ishii's colleagues confessed in shocking detail to the crimes they had committed. Transcripts from those hearings told of frostbite chambers, plague bombs, and experiments on pregnant women. But in the Western world, the news barely made headlines. The United States dismissed the Soviet reports as propaganda, even though Washington already knew the truth. American intelligence officers in Tokyo were quietly negotiating with Shiro Ishii. They wanted his research, every scrap of data, every table of infection rates, every note on how diseases spread. The United States had seen what biological weapons could do, and in the dawning Cold War, they didn't want the Soviets to have that knowledge first. So Ishii was offered complete immunity. He handed over his records, gave several briefings to U.S. Army scientists, and then disappeared from the public eye. The doctors who had assisted him followed the same path: no trials, no prison sentences, only new careers and clean reputations. The victims had no graves, no compensation, and for decades, not even acknowledgement that they had existed. In China, the ruins of Pingfang were fenced off and left to decay. In Japan, the topic was banned from textbooks. Young students learned about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but never about the laboratories in Manchuria. A few journalists tried to investigate, but documents were missing and witnesses stayed silent. The nation that had built Unit 731 chose collective amnesia. For the survivors and the families of those who had vanished, forgetting was impossible. In the villages around Harbin, old men and women still told stories of airplanes that dropped strange black specks from the sky, after which fever and swelling swept through the population. Farm animals died overnight, entire households followed within days. They buried their dead in shallow graves, fearing contagion. They didn't know that the black specks were plague-infected fleas. For them, Unit 731 wasn't a rumor. It was memory etched into the soil. A few Japanese veterans who had served as guards or assistants at the facility carried their guilt for decades. In the 1980s and 1990s, some of them began to speak publicly. Their testimonies matched what Soviet records had shown. They described long corridors smelling of disinfectant, the metallic clang of operating tools, the silence after a subject stopped moving. One former medic recalled burning bodies in pits behind the main building while snow fell quietly around him. Another spoke of sealing a gas chamber door and hearing muffled voices fade inside. Each confession reopened wounds that Japan's society had tried to close. When the truth could no longer be denied, scholars and activists demanded official recognition. In the mid-1990s, lawsuits were filed in Japanese courts by Chinese survivors and families of victims. They asked for compensation and, more importantly, an apology. The government admitted that Unit 731 had existed but argued that individual claims were barred by post-war treaties. No financial reparations were granted, but the discussion finally entered public consciousness. Museums and documentaries began to appear, each shedding light on a history that had lived too long in darkness. For historians, the documents recovered from Unit 731 were both horrifying and invaluable. They revealed a cold, methodical effort to weaponize disease, detailed charts of infection cycles, notes on optimal temperature for bacterial growth, and observations of human reactions to toxins and pressure. Scientists in the West quietly incorporated some of this data into early Cold War bio-defense programs. The irony was bitter. Knowledge gained through murder now used to prevent the same. Ethicists later argued that even if such information could save lives, using it without confronting its origin was a moral failure. Shiro Ishii himself remained a ghost. He was seen occasionally in Tokyo living comfortably, attending medical meetings under a false name. He never faced trial, never issued an apology. He died in 1959, reportedly of throat cancer, his death largely unnoticed. Only a handful of his former colleagues attended his funeral. No monument marks his grave. In the following decades, others from the unit quietly rose in Japanese academia and industry. Some became university professors teaching medicine, others joined pharmaceutical companies or government research programs. Their expertise, sharpened in the laboratories of Pingfang, now guided Japan's post-war scientific boom. To outsiders, they were respected professionals. Few knew the origins of their training. Meanwhile, in China, investigators continued to uncover evidence. In the early 1980s, construction workers in Harbin unearthed piles of human bones beneath what had once been a building foundation. Forensic analysis showed saw marks consistent with surgical dissection. There were skulls of men, women, and children, silent witnesses finally pulled from the ground. Chinese historians began collecting testimonies from surviving villagers, piecing together the scale of infection campaigns that had ravaged provinces like Zhejiang and Hunan. Estimates suggested that more than 200,000 civilians had died from biological attacks linked to Ishii's program. When the first permanent museum opened on the former site of Unit 731, visitors walked through rooms preserved in chilling authenticity, rusted operating tables, glass specimen jars still cloudy with residue, and walls lined with photographs of victims. Some exhibits displayed the written orders that authorized human experimentation, signed with neat military stamps. Each artifact told a story that no government could erase. For many Japanese visitors, it was the first time they realized what their country had done. As the new millennium approached, calls for acknowledgement grew louder. Japanese school teachers, historians, and civic groups began campaigning to include Unit 731 in national history curricula. Right-wing politicians resisted, claiming the accounts were exaggerated or fabricated by wartime propaganda. But survivors' testimonies were too consistent to ignore. Footage emerged of former medical officers admitting their roles on camera, old men trembling as they spoke of the things they had seen. Their faces carried the weight of half a century of silence. Beyond politics, the story of Unit 731 forced the world to confront uncomfortable questions about science and ethics. How could doctors, trained to heal, inflict such suffering? What happens when patriotism blinds conscience, when research is driven not by curiosity but by conquest? Modern bioethics, the rules that now govern medical experimentation, were partly shaped by these questions. The requirement of informed consent, the emphasis on human dignity, the oversight of institutional review boards, all arose from lessons written in blood during the Second World War. Even today, researchers studying pandemic prevention sometimes encounter references to data obtained from Unit 731. Many choose not to use it, believing that knowledge built on cruelty carries an unerasable stain. Others argue that ignoring it wastes information that might save lives. The debate continues, a moral echo from the frozen fields of Manchuria. For the descendants of victims, remembrance is not about revenge. Each year, memorial services are held at the Harbin Museum. Families bring photographs of ancestors who disappeared in the 1940s. They light incense, bow their heads, and read the names aloud, names that once existed only in secret records. Schoolchildren stand quietly beside them, learning that the horrors of war are not just battles and flags, but laboratories and test tubes too. The ceremony ends with a single message written on a plaque: "May the dead warn the living." In Japan, attitudes are changing slowly. Younger generations are more willing to face uncomfortable history. Documentaries air on national television. Survivors are invited to speak at universities. The shame of Unit 731 can never be erased, but confronting it has begun to heal something deeper: the silence that once protected it. For a nation that values honor, acknowledging dishonor has become an act of courage. Across the world, historians continue to uncover fragments of the story: declassified American files, diaries of soldiers, forgotten photographs. Each new discovery expands the record and narrows the distance between myth and fact. The more we learn, the clearer it becomes that Unit 731 was not an isolated aberration, but a warning about what happens when scientific ambition outruns moral restraint. The laboratories at Pingfang are long gone. Grass covers the foundations and only a few walls remain standing. In winter, snow drifts through broken windows where once men in white coats moved briskly with clipboards and scalpels. The air is silent now, but the earth beneath still holds what they tried to hide. History, like the ground, never forgets decades past, but the past did not fade. For the people of Northeast China, the war was not something that could be neatly filed away in history books. Every year the snow thawed, and the fields revealed pieces of metal, glass, and sometimes human bone. Children playing in the dirt would sometimes uncover a rusted scalpel or a fragment of ceramic bomb casing. The old people would fall silent and say only, "That was from the time of the experiments." When survivors finally began to speak in public, their stories shared a haunting sameness. They remembered soldiers in white coats who came into their villages with polite smiles and clipboards. They remembered being promised medicine and then growing sick after injections. Many had lost their families in the outbreaks that followed, never realizing until decades later that those diseases had been spread deliberately. For them, the memory of Unit 731 was not a chapter in history, but a wound that never healed. As the testimonies multiplied, journalists from across the world began to listen. They visited Harbin, filmed the crumbling remains of the laboratories, and interviewed elderly villagers who still bore scars on their arms. Slowly, what had once been dismissed as wartime rumor turned into undeniable fact. In Japan itself, a new generation of reporters and historians started to challenge the silence of their elders. They found letters hidden in attics, medical theses written by doctors who had served under Ishii, and official documents stamped with the seal of the Imperial Army Medical Department. Piece by piece, the machinery of denial began to fall apart. The revelations forced Japan to look inward. How could a nation that prided itself on discipline and culture have allowed such cruelty? How could physicians sworn to heal the sick have transformed into instruments of death? The answers were complex. Some said it was blind obedience to the emperor. Others said it was the pressure of war and the intoxication of power. But many Japanese citizens, especially the young, began to see it as a lesson about moral responsibility, about how patriotism without conscience can become poison. In universities, ethics professors used the example of Unit 731 when teaching medical students about consent and humanity. They showed photographs of the laboratories and asked their students to imagine the people who had once stood there, believing they were serving science and their country. Every year, students signed a pledge to uphold the dignity of every patient. For them, the ghosts of Pingfang were not just history, they were guardians of the line between science and savagery. Outside story of Unit 731 fed a wider debate about justice. Some human rights advocates argued that the immunity given to Ishii and his team had been one of the greatest moral compromises of the 20th century. By trading truth for data, they said, the victors had betrayed the victims. Others believed the Cold War had forced impossible choices. Whatever the justification, the decision left a stain on the record of international justice, a reminder that even after victory, politics can still silence morality. In 2018, newly declassified American documents confirmed what many had long suspected. U.S. military intelligence had indeed collected data from Ishii's team and stored it in secret archives. The files contained detailed charts, experiment logs, and photographs. They were evidence not only of atrocities but also of how easily moral lines blur when nations fear one another. Reading those pages, one could see the thin thread that connects fear to cruelty and cruelty to knowledge. At the same time, a quieter kind of justice was unfolding in classrooms, museums, and documentaries. The more people learned, the less they could deny. In Harbin, a teacher would stand before her students each spring and tell them about the families who had vanished in the 1940s. She would remind them that those people had names, dreams, and laughter before they were reduced to test subjects. The students would then walk to the memorial site, placing flowers beside the rusted remains of surgical tools. They would bow their heads not in hatred, but in understanding. In Japan, civic volunteers organized exhibitions where visitors could read the letters of soldiers who had served at Pingfang. Some of those letters were almost unbearable to read. One young soldier wrote to his parents that he had joined a medical research unit, believing he would save lives. His last letter, written months later, was a plea for forgiveness. "I thought I was serving my country, but now I see I was destroying people. Please forgive your foolish son." He never returned home. No one knows whether he took his own life or was silenced by his superiors. But his words survived, passed from hand to hand until they became part of a nation's conscience. For historians, Unit 731 has become a case study in the collapse of ethics under totalitarian pressure. It shows how ordinary professionals, scientists, doctors, engineers, can become instruments of horror when they surrender judgment to ideology. It reminds the modern world that progress without morality is not progress at all. In an era when genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and bioweapon research advance at unprecedented speed, the questions raised by Unit 731 remain painfully relevant. What boundaries should never be crossed? Who decides when knowledge becomes too dangerous? And how do we ensure that curiosity never again becomes cruelty? There are moments during the memorial ceremonies in Harbin when silence fills the hall. The visitors stand before photographs of victims and realize that some of the faces are no older than their own children. The silence is heavy but not empty. It carries the weight of memory, the echo of all those who could not speak for themselves. An elderly survivor once said to a reporter, "When we tell our stories, the dead live again for a moment. When we stop, they die a second time." That sentence became the motto of the museum. Some Japanese families whose ancestors had worked in Unit 731 have begun to speak publicly too. They express remorse and offer prayers at the memorial each year. Their gestures cannot erase the past, but they bridge a gap between two peoples who once saw each other only as enemies. Slowly, conversation replaces silence and compassion replaces denial. In 2015, a joint Japanese-Chinese academic conference was held in Tokyo. It was the first of its kind. Scholars from both countries presented research, survivors gave testimonies, and for the first time, Japanese officials stood on stage and acknowledged the full extent of the atrocities. The audience wept quietly. One historian described it later as a moment when history took a breath. For 70 years, truth had been buried under politics, pride, and fear. That day, it finally surfaced. Today, the ruins of the Pingfang complex are a museum and a warning. Visitors walk through corridors where rusted pipes still run along the walls. They pass display cases of surgical instruments, preserved documents, and grainy photographs of doctors standing over patients who cannot be named. Outside, a marble monument bears a simple inscription in Chinese and Japanese, "Never again." The air is cold and still. You can hear the wind move through the grass, and if you listen long enough, you might imagine the faint hum of the machines that once worked there. It is not superstition, it is memory itself, refusing to disappear. After the Tokyo trials ended and the headlines faded, the world turned toward rebuilding. But in the quiet corners of China and Japan, the echoes of what had happened at Unit 731 lingered like a sickness that refused to heal. The scars were not only physical, they were moral, spiritual, and generational. For the victims' families, justice was never delivered. For the perpetrators, accountability never came. And for decades, the rest of the world looked away. The immunity deals granted by American intelligence officers meant that much of the data from Unit 731 was shipped across the Pacific, filed, and classified. The reasoning was simple but chilling: information on how diseases spread, how frostbite damages tissue, how pathogens behave under different conditions. Such data might be useful for defense research. It was a bargain between morality and military advantage, and the consequences of that bargain would shape ethical debates for the rest of the century. In China, the physical evidence of the atrocities remained buried until the 1980s, when archaeologists and local residents began excavating the grounds of the old Pingfang complex. They found remnants that no soil could hide: surgical tools, glass containers labeled with Latin names, remnants of uniforms, and skeletal remains of men, women, and children. The discovery confirmed what survivors had been saying for decades. It also reignited anger and grief that had simmered beneath silence. Documentaries and newspaper reports followed. Cameras moved through the crumbling hallways of the former laboratories, where rust and decay had replaced the hum of machines. Each photograph told a story of absence, the absence of justice, of accountability, of acknowledgement. For many Chinese families, those images were the first public proof that their pain was not a rumor but history. Meanwhile, within Japan, a slow reckoning began. The post-war generation started to ask questions their parents had avoided. University archives were searched, secret files surfaced. A handful of retired military doctors, now old men in their 80s and 90s, began to talk. Their memories were fragmentary but consistent: the fear of speaking out during the war, the belief that they were serving their nation, and the guilt that had haunted them ever since. Their words carried the tremor of truth, the kind that comes not from ideology but from conscience. One former medic, interviewed in the 1990s, said softly, "We were told that our work would save Japanese soldiers. We were told that these people were already enemies. I wanted to believe that. But at night, I could still hear the voices of those we used." His confession aired on national television and shocked the public. For younger viewers, it was the first time they realized that the atrocities of World War II were not confined to far away Europe but had been committed in their own nation's name. The revelations forced a new national conversation. Textbook committees debated whether to include Unit 731 in official curricula. Politicians argued about whether formal apologies should be issued. Some right-wing groups still denied the extent of the crimes, calling them exaggerations. But the evidence had become too overwhelming. Scholars from Japan and abroad presented consistent documentation, military orders, photographs, and testimony from both sides of the conflict. The debate could no longer be about whether it happened, but about what lessons could be learned from it. Internationally, the rediscovery of Unit 731 changed how the scientific community viewed ethics. During the 1970s and 1980s, as biotechnology advanced, research institutions began establishing independent ethics boards. Many of those committees cited Unit 731, alongside Nazi medical experiments, as examples of how science can become corrupted when moral limits are erased. Every consent form signed by a modern research subject, every safety protocol followed in a laboratory, owes something to the victims who had none of those protections. Their suffering reshaped the boundaries of modern medicine. In 2002, Japanese courts once again reviewed lawsuits brought by Chinese survivors. The judges acknowledged that the Imperial Army had indeed conducted biological warfare, but they denied individual compensation on legal grounds. The plaintiffs left disappointed, but they had achieved something else: an official record, signed and stamped by the Japanese judiciary, confirming that the atrocities were real. It was a small victory in a long struggle against forgetting. Across the ocean, the United States quietly released some of its classified files. Researchers poring over the documents found chilling details: lists of bacterial strains, experimental designs, and coded reports from Ishii's team. What struck readers most was not just the content, but the bureaucratic tone of it all, the way unimaginable suffering had been reduced to neat columns of data. It was a reminder that evil rarely announces itself with horns and fire. More often, it comes dressed in paperwork and precision. By the early 21st century, the site of Unit 731 had become a museum and an international research center for the study of wartime medical crimes. Visitors from around the world came to walk its halls, read survivor accounts, and confront the dark intersection between science and cruelty. Inside one exhibit stood a simple wooden desk, reconstructed from photographs. On it lay a single journal replica open to a blank page. A plaque beside it read, "Science must serve life or it will destroy it." Every year, on August 15th, the anniversary of Japan's surrender, students from both Japan and China gather at the site for a peace ceremony. They release white paper cranes into the sky, each bearing a handwritten message. Some are apologies, some are prayers, some simply say, "We remember." As the cranes drift upward, the children look at one another, realizing that the distance between them is not measured in nationality but in shared humanity. For historians, Unit 731 remains one of the clearest examples of how ideology can corrupt intellect. The men who worked there were not monsters by birth. Many were highly educated, some brilliant. Their transformation into instruments of suffering was gradual, rationalized step by step until morality became an inconvenience. That realization is what makes the story so terrifying and so necessary to tell. Because if ordinary people could commit such acts once, they could do so again under the right conditions. Modern researchers studying emerging diseases sometimes still reference the data collected during the war. Some refuse to use it on ethical grounds. Others argue that ignoring it would waste hard-won knowledge. The debate itself is a reflection of the moral complexity left behind. Can knowledge born of cruelty ever be cleansed? There is no simple answer, but the question keeps the memory alive. Shiro Ishii's name rarely appears in Japanese textbooks even today, yet his shadow lingers over every discussion of wartime science. Some biographers have tried to piece together his post-war life. They believe he spent his final years advising on public health projects, perhaps seeking redemption in obscurity. No document records his repentance, but history judges him nonetheless. His greatest legacy is not the data he gathered, but the moral boundary his crimes helped define. Standing in the museum today, one can feel the weight of those boundaries. The floors are clean, the air still. You can hear the distant hum of traffic outside, yet inside it feels suspended in another time. Photographs line the walls, doctors in crisp uniforms, anonymous patients under white sheets, rows of instruments gleaming under bright lights. Everything looks clinical, efficient, almost ordinary. That is what makes it frightening. It shows how horror can hide behind order, how evil can disguise itself as duty. When the tour ends, visitors exit through a narrow corridor that opens onto daylight. At the door, a small sign bears an inscription in 3 languages. To remember is to prevent. People pause, read the words, and step out into the sun. Some wipe away tears, others walk silently. The story of Unit 731 is not just about Japan or China or World War II. It is about the fragile line between civilization and barbarism, and how easily that line can be crossed when fear, obedience, and ambition combine. It is a warning carved into history that science without conscience is the most dangerous weapon of all. Even now, researchers and ethicists continue to study this dark chapter, not to justify it, but to ensure it is never repeated. In classrooms around the world, teachers show photographs of the memorial, telling students about the importance of compassion in science. They speak not of revenge, but of responsibility. Every generation must learn it anew, because the temptation to look away always returns. The survivors who once testified are now gone, their voices preserved in recordings. In those recordings you can hear the strength of people who endured the unendurable and still chose to speak. Their courage gives meaning to remembrance. As one survivor said shortly before her death, "We cannot change what was done, but we can change what is allowed to happen next." And that, perhaps, is the final message of Unit 731, not a story of cruelty alone, but a call to conscience. The laboratories have fallen to dust, the perpetrators are long dead, but the moral lesson remains. Humanity cannot afford to forget, because forgetting is the first step toward repetition. Every time we choose empathy over hatred, truth over silence, we deny history the chance to repeat itself. As the sun sets over the memorial site, the shadows stretch across the ground where thousands once suffered. The wind rustles through the grass, carrying faint echoes of voices that can never be heard again. Somewhere, a visitor lays a single white flower on the stone. It is quiet, peaceful, and unbearably human. And in that silence, the world listens not to the past alone, but to its own reflection.